There's been mixed reactions from around the world to the coup in Niger. Now we're going to explore the reactions of the CNN, see who they've decided to bring on, how they react to this, how they analyze the news, and react to their reaction. Let's get into it.
There are some people who do support President Bazoum in Niger, but you have a lot of people who would rather have a military takeover, would rather have the democratically elected president ousted if it means undoing its ties to its former colonial power. That's what people would rather, which I find fascinating.
When she says she finds it fascinating, she means completely shocking. Completely shocking that, the desire to untangle yourself from, when is it, 1960 Niger got independence. We're now in 2023. So 63 years of post-colonial, subjugation by the former colonial power. The idea that the Nigerians would want to move away from this is completely, what did she use?
Shocking.
Shocking. No, she said she finds it fascinating. Fascinating.
They want to break the yoke. So people who've been chained all this time, and when the moment they break the chain is fascinating. Like, it should be expected. Yeah. It actually should be fascinating that it has taken this long, maybe.
Yes, exactly. It's also fascinating that, 63 years on, 2/3 of people from Niger have no access to electricity. It's also fascinating that, 1/3 of their uranium supplied to France is from Niger, but it's the second poorest country in the world. It's also fascinating that it's also the second poorest country in the world. So how has it benefited from these so-called democratic process that they're now trying to overturn?
So something else, I've noticed the kind of, say, obsession with electoral democracy, because she admits that, there's plenty of people who showed up to support the military, but then again kind of discards that method of, exercising the democracy in favor of the ballot. So I think it's dishonest for an American in wherever that place is.
Washington.
Yeah, to hold Nigerians to a standard even Americans themselves, don't follow.
And also the issue of democracy as a concept on its own, people have to understand, say, it should be a means to an end. So just the electoral democracy where people get an opportunity to go to the ballot every 5 or 4 years, if they're not seeing the actual material benefits, their lives improving, then you don't expect them to still want to respect the so-called tenets of democracy. So somehow it reflects to say, what are the conditions on the ground? So that's what you should be looking to say, what has driven people to disregard the much talked about democracy?
And adding on to that, what's democracy? The rule of the people, for the people, by the people. When a government, signs deals that give away the country's resources for almost nothing to France, the people don't benefit it. That's not a government for the people. Yeah. So, in a way, that's not democracy. But when people come and, express their desire to see France leave, and you have the military exercising the will of the people, that sounds like more of democracy than showing up to the ballot every 5 years, as Nzala has said.
Yeah, it's bourgeoisie democracy, and you can't eat the ballot paper. You need real development and real infrastructure. Let's get into this and see what else she's got to say.
Also on top of that, France has said, listen, well, we're going to sort of limit our cooperation with Niger, or sort of reevaluate our partnership with Niger when it comes to humanitarian aid and that sort of thing, which of course means that it's the poorest Nigerians that will suffer. Mm-hmm. But how hard is it to undo a coup? France is obviously trying to wield a lot of financial pressure on Niger, hoping to turn the tide, but really, once a coup is done, aren't we past the point of no return here?
It's really challenging to say that right now. So far, we are several days into this. The coup kicked off on Wednesday. No one has actually seen President Bazoum other than a few photos and some communications with folks like the Secretary of State here in the United States. So because we haven't seen him, I think that there's potentially still conversations taking place inside the presidential palace with those who carried out the coup and with the folks who are still technically holding the reins of power. That said, I just want to go back to one of the comments you made about the popularity of the coup. In Niamey, there is certainly a lot of chatter right now about whether this is popular or not. Outside Niamey, which is 18 million people and growing in a 20 million person country. You still have a lot of, there's a dichotomy of who's in support of the Bazoum administration and who's in support of the putschists. So it really is split. Niamey just happens to be a lot of capital, the people who lived in the capital are political elites. And those political elites have always kind of had a lot of tension with Bazoum, someone who was always kind of perceived as a political outsider in many ways.
Political outsider in many ways. She hasn't even listed one. One of the ways, so it would have been nice if you're going to bring up such a point, you need to back it up with a few examples of what makes him a political outsider.
And also, noting her first question is, how do we undo the coup? Not, why do Nigerian people support this coup? What has French-Niger partnerships, held for the people of Niger? The first question of this liberal is, how do we undo the coup? Yes. Not even, investigating the motivation behind the coup.
Yes, and she also said, well, now France is going to roll back on the partnership, so people from Niger are going to miss out. And yeah, you have to ask yourself, what type of partnership is it when one party gets all the benefits and the other party loses out on every conceivable, aspect? It's the kind of partnership that you get between the rope and the hanging man. Now, what I found most interesting about this is she says the people in Niamey are the political elite. Now, for a country that's the second poorest country in the world, that's a lot of political elites.
So it means all those people we're seeing on the streets, the thousands, they are all from the political elite.
Yeah, they're the middle classes. They all drove in. They all had drivers drive them in, park up,
just show up.
And then just show up.
And
it's crazy.
And also number one, first of all, how would she know?
Yes.
First of all, say the people outside Niamey, probably they are not in support of the coup. How does she know? So it's the whole issue.
Don't you know she works for a think tank?
Oh, she works for a think tank.
Works for a think tank in Washington D.C.
In Washington D.C.
Of course, she knows everything.
Maybe she has been to Africa for a safari, so she knows, or she's got a friend from Africa, so she knows about these things. So it's also problematic of this issue of so-called experts who are usually brought on these international channels. So most of the time they find sometimes these people have never been to Africa. Two, these are people, maybe they spent a month in Africa at some 5-star hotel, they were meeting with local elites in the lobby and they had a few drinks. Then they think that they're African experts. Because if CNN was really serious about getting a proper perspective, they're in Washington D.C., where it's a melting pot of people from many different countries. They could have gotten someone from Niger or even one of the countries in the region. They're going to get a much better perspective. But I think certain people, they believe that probably certain faces, I won't name what criteria I'm using, they are much more qualified to talk about these things. The public is much more likely to believe them than to get another person.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to bring it up, but since you brought it up, I have to. It's very interesting here that we have an African presenter interviewing a European American woman about a situation that's happened in Niger in West Africa. It's just fascinating. How is this person the qualified expert? I checked her bio before we came in. So she's the head of a so-called non-government organization based in Washington, D.C. I have my suspicion that it's not really non-government organization and it has many links to the government, but who knows, I could be proven wrong. Let's watch the rest of this video and find out.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's mostly in the capital, Niamey, where we're seing a lot of the coup supporters. Fine. Okay, that's a good point that you just made there. So we're also seeing in the capital, in Niamey, where we're getting a lot of the pictures from, a lot of people waving Russian flags. I mean, there does seem to be a sort of pivot happening among some people away from France and I guess the United States as well. Obviously, we're talking about France here, and a pivot towards Russia. Russia's obviously going to want to capitalize on the instability. What will they want from Niger in return? This is obviously a country that is rich in resources, especially when it comes to uranium.
Mm-hmm. And their upcoming oil production, which is supposed to boom, although that might be on hold given the coup.
just on that. Do you hear the way she said that? Well, now that the oil production is going to stop because of the coup. Are you guys sure you want to continue on this path? Mm-hmm. Just the way that just the little things that they drop.
And one other thing I noticed, when she talked about France, people maybe not wanting France, she didn't question what the French wanted from Niger. But because it's now Russia, one has to question to say what's in for the Russians. But for the West, nobody questions them because they are Their motivations are always pure. They've never colonized Africa. They've never looted African countries. So we shouldn't. Yeah, they've never enslaved Africans. We've got no reason to be suspicious of the West. But the other powers, we should be suspicious of them.
They're going to capitalize off the insecurity. That's what she says. Yeah. It's true. I never even thought about that. There's no at all aspect of what France tries to get out of Niger for not only the 63 years since it's been independent, but the whole period during the colonial era.
It's not questioned.
William.
Yeah, I mean, basically it's the Russian question. And, you know, coming from the US, they obviously have their interests in Niger. They have the biggest drone base in Niger, part of AFRICOM, to safeguard American interests. The French are also there. Then question arises, look at the countries that are partnering with Russia, Burkina Faso, Mali. You know, all of them, yes, they have an insurgency problem. But what drove them to going with Russia as a security partner? And just picking an example, in Syria, after al-Assad was, you know, faced with an ISIS onslaught, he called on the Russians. And today, he has consolidated his position as Syria's president, and his country is whole due to the partnership, not like disqualifying the incredible sacrifices of the Syrians, but Russian help has also, you know, played a part in them pushing back against the insurgents. So if African people see that taking place, why wouldn't they want to replicate it here? Compare it to wherever the US or France has been. You know, there's the question, who has been saved by the West?
Great point, William. And yeah, let's just look at the other two countries that you just mentioned, Burkina Faso and Mali. Now, you know, over the last 12 months, they've taken steps to remove French influence in their country. And why have they done this? You know, people say, oh, they've kicked out French NGOs. They kicked out French NGOs because they realize these are, again, not non-government organizations. They're linked and working, you know, hand in hand with the French state to destabilize the country, to further justify the French presence in the region. They kicked out French media. They go, how, stamping down on freedom of press. Again, the French media they kicked out, France 24, RFI. Again, they were France 24, I believe, interviewed the head of an insurgency, Al-Qaeda insurgency, that is, you know, killing people, slaughtering people like sheep and goat on the streets, and they give them a platform. They would never do that to anyone that committed a terrorist act in the West.
Imagine Osama bin Laden after 9/11, like probably on a Zoom call on CNN.
Yeah.
Well, what's happening?
Or any people that, you know, part of the Paris terrorist attacks. Yeah. If you found, like, you know, their supporters or part of the group of their terrorist cell being interviewed on the BBC, they'd be super upset. So, you know, this is all very important context, completely and purposely ignored by the mainstream media. And again, in Niger, it's a similar thing. They think that, okay, we have this insurgency problem. France has been saying it's been fighting this insurgency problem. The US is saying it's been supporting us with this insurgency problem. Yet we see no gains.
Leave alone no gains, it's actually gotten worse. In 2003, there were 23 deaths as a result of terrorism. Last year, it was 7,900. You have the Americans there with a $100 million drone base and 1,000 military personnel there. You have the French there with 1,500 people. Yet 7,900 Nigerians died last year from terrorism. So, you know, if you have these foreign powers on your soil with the sole purpose of stopping terrorist, you know, victims or stopping people from dying as a result of terrorism, you have to ask yourself questions, you know, what's not happening? Because, I mean, if you take another example, take Somalia, for example. Al-Shabaab came into, you know, prominence in 2006 after the US encouraged Ethiopia to invade Somalia. That's what led to the rise of Al-Shabaab. And since then, supposedly, US and their local partners, Uganda, Kenya, have, you know, supposedly been in Somalia to fight Al-Shabaab for over 14 years. This group is, you know, only growing.
Yeah.
So
yeah, let's look further afield. Afghanistan. They went into Afghanistan and not just handed over the country to Taliban, made them one of the best, well-equipped armies in the world. And no disrespect to the people of Afghanistan or to the Taliban, I don't want to be on their hit list, but you saw the Taliban fighters in the gym not knowing how to use the machines, not knowing how to use the machines. So these guys were there you know, at the expense of billions and billions of dollars.
Thousands of lives.
Thousands of lives.
Hundreds of thousands, actually.
Yes, and you know, all of the statistics regarding, you know, women's rights were worsened during their time. You know, drug exports, opium, all these things went through the roof, which the Taliban, you know, had actually brought down and regulated. So all of the statistics that they went in there to try solve got worse over their time, and they leave the country in a worse situation than what they found it. So there's no, you know, it's quite obvious why Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, you know, they see what's going on in the global arena. They can see that these Western powers, when they say they're coming in to help, always have ulterior motives, always want to maintain a presence, a foothold in your country, control how your country's governed, control who you have military alliances with, control who you have economic alliances with, and basically continue colonialism by a different means.
And I think also there's one aspect, like these countries which have got a huge defense industry. So when, like, if they were to nip the insurgents in the bud, it means certain people will stop earning money from the equipment that they are selling. So you cannot trust a carpenter who makes coffins when he gives you a herbal remedy. So you are going to question, because it's in his interest that you die so that your family can buy a coffin from him.
Definitely.
Great point. I've got a feeling that this goose has got more eggs to give us still. So let's keep playing.
Not fully clear. It's also, I just want to caveat and say that there is absolutely no evidence right now that Russia is behind this. There is no evidence they fomented this. Similar to Mali and Burkina Faso.
But they want to capitalize on it.
Yes,
they
of course.
want to capitalize on it, right.
Nice little correction there. But they want to capitalize on it. She wanted to make sure that was...
Based in Niger,
that point cannot be missed.
I think if I could guess, from when I used to work for the State Department, I was based in Niger.
Aha! Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah, we have it, folks.
Houston, we have liftoff.
Yeah, so let me just start.
Go for it.
So we have a former employee of the State Department speaking about Niger and potential Russian interests in the region. You know, I cannot say for sure the Russian interest there, but I'll speak to the role of the State Department in, like, the wider narrative creation. Because take the NED, for example. When you go to the
National Endowment for Democracy.
Yes. When you go to their site, it says it's a non-governmental organization.
Yeah.
But it gets its funding from Congress. And further, it's a CIA cutout, which, you know, same as USA, they could come to a place, see you're protesting about, say, you know, cost of living and whatever. Totally legitimate case, of course. But they just hijack the movement so that should resolution be found, they'll be exactly where they need to be to, like, you know, steward the future. So if, say, there's a protest and they, you know, plant one of their leaders there, should negotiations come, it's their leader that's going to negotiate with their interests in mind. So just bringing that out, that the State Department shouldn't be seen as this neutral party.
Yes.
And if I may, so, you know, there's also an issue of projection. Because sometimes I think she thinks other countries does what the US does. They are, like you've said, they can be genuine protests in a certain country. Then they are always looking for loopholes on how they are going to jump in, and so that they can insert themselves into the equation. And sometimes, at least for maybe Russia, if it jumps at the opportunity, it's different from the US, who actually manufacture forced crisis. Sometimes we've seen it in Latin America, in certain countries in the Middle East and the like. So literally they will manufacture crisis so that they can just have an entry hole to get into the country and change the political system and to install their puppets.
Yeah, I just want to make a point. So very interesting what you said about National Endowment for Democracy, and it's worth stating that the founder of the National Endowment for Democracy says, we do now what the CIA used to do covertly. As an expert from a so-called non-government organization, again it speaks to, was there no one from Niger or from the Sahel or from West Africa that you could have got to be objective? We're constantly told the CNN, BBC, these are the standard bearers for journalism.
Yeah.
But they get someone who has vested interest, a dog in the fight. Africom's biggest presence is in Niger.
Yeah.
You know, the CIA drone program, its headquarters is in Niger. and yet they get someone who's clearly partisan on the issue. So they don't even try to hide the fact. It's just, you know, they put it on their website, and just like this NGO director. She says she's an NGO director, but you know, 4 minutes 56 into the interview, she's admitting
she's from the State Department.
She's from the State Department. I've got a feeling she's going to admit a lot more because she's got the ball rolling now. So let's see what else she has to say.
I would guess that Russia sees Niger as a huge linchpin in the region that has always been kind of our bulwark of stability. We put a lot of investments in Niger, not just in development and humanitarian, but massive amounts of security investments as well. And if Russia can so easily undo that for us, as in the U.S. and Western security partners.
She took the dot out of the U.S. Now it's just us.
Yeah, clearly, you know, like the last few sequences, whatever she talked about had nothing to do with the interests of the people of Niger. She's talking about the massive security investments they've made and how Russia is going to undo them and how it will disadvantage the US. So she doesn't care about the people of Niger, those 18 million people outside Niamey who she so much believes that they are against the coup. It now clearly shows that she doesn't care about those.
It's about us.
Yeah, it's about us.
It's about us.
Security partners. That would be a huge loss.
For us.
And when it comes to just the, you know, ordinary, everyday Nigerians who, I mean, you know, that country is one of the poorest, not just in the world, but, you know, one of the poorest in Africa, despite being rich in so many resources. You talked about, obviously, them.
Did you hear that?
Not just in the world.
Nigeria is not just one of the poorest countries in the world, but in Africa, as if Africa is separate to the world, and if Africa is poorer indicator than the world.
Yeah.
Newsflash, sister, if you're the second poorest country in the world, then of course you're going to be one of the poorest countries in Africa.
And also something about the obsession with, you know, American investments in Niger. What nature of investments are we talking about? $500 million since 2012 to go into security matters. Basically, you know, funding Niger's puppet government. But the real or the root cause of insecurity in the Sahel is economic disempowerment. If these youth who are in Niger, who are in ISIS and Al-Qaeda right now, if they had stuff to do, if they had fulfilling lives, there will be no need to join, you know, these armed groups. But the reason they join them is because there are no economic opportunities for
100%.
them. But it's not in the interest of these Western powers, France included, to address the root cause of Niger's insecurity.
Yeah, I mean, Al-Qaeda don't go recruiting in Beverly Hills
Yeah.
or, you know, in wealthy parts of London. I've not been to the wealthy parts of London, so I wouldn't know. But they don't go to the wealthy parts to recruit, you know, they go to the poor, disenfranchised, marginalized youth that have nothing to lose anyway and say, come join us. You're going to get loads of money. You're going to get loads of adventure, a lot more than what's going on right now.
And it gives a bit of a purpose. You know, you feel that you are living for something because then...
Yeah.
And just speaking on the Russian interest in Africa, Russia has interest in Africa. So does France, so does the US, so does the US and China. All of them have an interest in Africa. So the question will be, how do our interests align? African interests and Western interests do not go along in any way because we've had a history, 400 years of colonization, subjugation, robbery, slavery, all that. China has been in contact with Africa since the 1400s, the 1300s. So they didn't come and take slaves. We used to do business. In the coast of Kenya, for example, there were discoveries of coins from India and China, as you know, ranging back hundreds of years. So it's not new that Africa has been engaging with the outside world. The question will be, what does Africa benefit from engaging with the outside world? Take China, for example. Africa's got infrastructure, roads, schools, all that. Stuff that will build the productive capacity of Africans. But what has the West given Africa 400 years after knowing them?
Yeah, I mean, they'll say, well, you speak French, but to whose benefit is that?
I wish I didn't. That's all.
Yeah. Despite being rich in so many resources, you talked about, obviously, them working towards oil production as well. But despite being so rich in uranium, it is one of the poorest countries in the world. What happens to the average, ordinary Nigerian if France and...
She says, despite having uranium, Nigeria is among the poorest countries and leaves it at that. no further, interrogation.
Investigation. Yeah.
Why does Niger have all this uranium, seventh biggest producer in the world, yet still is the poorest country in the world? And if she asks that question, I'm sure she'll find that France is not, as clean as she'd like to believe.
Yeah, good point.
The United States say, well, listen, now that there's been this coup, now that President Bazoum, who was our partner, who we trusted, has been ousted, we're not going to provide this country with as much aid or military assistance. Obviously, Islamic insurgency is also a massive problem across the Sahel as well.
Right. So immediate effect is it's possible, as France has said, that a lot of humanitarian aid will stop. The U.S. will not stop its humanitarian aid, or at least there's no indication of that. We typically separate our security assistance from humanitarian development programs. That will obviously impact the most vulnerable groups. You have a huge refugee and internally displaced population in Niger. There's always communities that are in need of humanitarian assistance. Obviously, that will have a visceral impact on them. In the long term, I don't necessarily see a huge shift. We can look at Mali and Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has its own problem set, obviously, but the people in northern Mali, aside from the jihadist insurgency, which is huge there, the access to humanitarian aid and livelihoods hasn't exactly changed unless there's actual conflict from jihadists. Now, where there's huge confusion and where I would point everyone to right now is that in the absence of clarity about who's in charge in terms of governance and security, the jihadists, specifically the Al-Qaeda-aligned Niamey and the Islamic State in the Sahel province that are operating in Tilbury, which is just a few kilometers northwest of the capital city, Niamey, those groups know how to take advantage of that governance and security gap, and they regularly exploit it for their gain. That's how they recruit locally. If they carried out an attack right now and security forces fled because they weren't getting an authorization from anyone in charge to, go forward and do force protection, then that's a huge win for jihadists and a huge loss, not just for Niger's credibility, but obviously for the rest of us who are looking at this region and seeing it as the last remaining bulwark of stability in West Africa.
See, I didn't have too much of a problem with her analysis, apart from how she ended. This is a problem for us, again, US minus the dot, is what she's talking about, because it affects the stability in West Africa, something that they see as their region of influence that has been stable. Now you got to interrogate stability at what cost. Yeah. So people have been stably and consistently poor. Is that fine?
Starve in your house, but quietly. That's the kind of stability they love. Don't make noise about it.
And even by whatever metrics they use, as I stated, in 2003, 23 people died from terror attacks. Last year, it was 7,900. So who has Niger been stable for? Definitely not the people of Niger.
It hasn't caused them problems, is what they mean.
That's what they mean.
Yeah, that's what they mean.
And one other point, she talks about how the military taking over is now a security threat. She said they're going to be disorganized how to respond to these attacks, terror attacks, possible terror attacks. But the thing to say she said people don't know who is in charge. I mean, maybe she doesn't know who is in charge, but I think everyone else, including the people in Niger, they know who is in charge.
Yes.
And the military, they've been at the forefront of fighting these insurgents. So if there are people who are in a better position to make decisions on how to deal with the insurgents, it's the people who are sitting in the presidential palace right now. So if anything, I see that the fight against insurgents is going to be more streamlined.
Yes.
Also, remember, before Traoré became president of Burkina Faso, he was in the front lines. He led a battalion. So, I mean, it's dishonest, to put it mildly.
Yeah, so he will know what the soldiers need, reinforcements, what's stopping them, equipment-wise, community, logistics, all of that.
Plus, consider the stated motive for the coup. The deteriorating security situation. Despite constant knowledge that we have this issue, the government in place had done nothing. That is what inspired the military to take over the government.
Sure. So let's wrap up. The coup just happened, less than a week ago. So still early days. However, the early signs are there that people on the ground in Niger support this coup, despite what this so-called expert says. She hasn't given us any material or research that we can refer to that says outside of the capital people are not supporting the coup, and it just find it fascinating the way the corporate Western mainstream media all know where their interests lie when it comes to these things. They've basically been reading off the same hymn sheet, saying the same stuff, not even been bothered to find Nigers to parrot their lines. Usually they find a local actor, you know, blackface, to say the things that they want to say. They've not even bothered to do
They
this.
don't even care anymore.
So, you know, this is really for the audience. We can't really say anything to CNN. CNN are going to be CNN. A scorpion stings because it's a scorpion. They're going to do the same things. This is really to the audience. Be wary. Whenever there's an incident that happens in the international arena, particularly in Africa, and you see all the mainstream media, the corporate media, condemning this as the worst thing in the world, but you see people on the ground celebrating this, decide whose side of the fence you're on. And that's probably how I should end this one, unless you got something else.
Sure. I mean, just highlighting the outsized influence of organizations such as CNN, BBC. You know, the world being under America's hegemony means their cultural exports are also, like, you know, really high. That means, you know, for Africa's middle class, CNN is what they want to watch when they would, like, want to understand global politics. So, like, imagine the brain rot such an interview will cause to Africans who follow CNN. Yeah. So it's probably a reason to follow African Stream.
And we'll end on that note. Thank you very much. Until next time, we've been African Stream, and this has been a reaction video. Peace out.